Hi everyone, this is Roger Yates doing his third one, YouTube type thing. Must apologise for the last one, it was a little bit too long, so I'm sorry about that. I'll try and keep them shorter. I think that was 20, almost getting on for 30 minutes, so sorry about that. Okay, just to remind you then who I am, been a vegan since 1979, involved in the movement at all kinds of levels. Worked for the national groups as a committee member at least, and been involved with the grassroots most of the time. Also done a bit of academia, so I looked at the British movement in my MA. For my PhD I looked at the ideology of speciesism. Okay, I want to introduce you also to Neville. This is Neville the van. He's the VIP van, Vegan Information Project, and going in for your test, aren't you, Nev, this week, so wish him luck. So we're hoping that's going to go well, don't we, Nev? Neville's got a personality, don't you know? I want to talk today then about defining or talking about veganism in the sense of what is it, okay? And it concerns me that there's a lot of reducitarianism going on in relation to veganism. So the reducitarians themselves, they're talking about veganism being just about food. So the vegan strategist will say that, for example, even going to the length of mocking the philosophy of veganism. The people who are, there's a group of kind of like human haters in the movement, unfortunately, and they tend to go under names like non-humans first, this kind of idea, and they tend to suggest that veganism is about other animals only, like this.
Let's get one thing straight here. Veganism is not about humans. Do you understand that? Veganism is not about people. Veganism is about nothing but non-humans. Animals.
Okay, now, sorry, that's wrong, and I think that's what a lot of people in the movement want veganism to be, but that's not what veganism is. Now, there's an issue here about how do we decide? I say that we look at what the founders of the vegan social movement thought veganism was, and we take that as our first step. I'm not saying that their views are law and that we can't change it. In fact, if you look at the 1979 Vegan Society definition, the one about practical and possible, that one, a lot of people suggest that was written by Donald Watson, which is not true. In fact, Watson didn't really define veganism too well. But also, the Vegan Society definition from '79 is not a very good one. I mean, it's pretty weak. And it certainly doesn't cover everything. But then again, when we have these conversations, people tend to dive for their definitions. And there's a problem with that. You know, one reason why the definition of veganism doesn't cover all of veganism is because veganism is a big idea. It's like suggesting that any definition of Marxism or quantum mechanics will define all of what those things mean, and you just can't do it. In fact, in a recent blog entry, which I'll put the link to below, I mentioned that modern day internet definitions of anything are usually full of hyperlinks. You know, if it's a big idea like Marxism again, if it's a big idea, then they're full of hyperlinks. In other words, saying, well, this is a basic definition, but that's not the whole story. Same goes with the vegan definition, folks. When you see the vegan definition, that's not all of it. And so I think how to understand that, though, is that the definition tends to look at the focus, but it doesn't really capture the entire scope of what veganism is all about. And in fact, if you go to the writings of someone like Leslie Cross, and Leslie Cross, he was writing in the late 40s, early 50s, and so he's one of the co-founders of the vegan social movement along with Donald Watson, And he was the guy who actually said, hang on a second, we don't really have a working definition here. We need to kind of sharpen ourselves up with this. And so when you look at his kind of writing, it's much kind of firmer on what veganism is, but he also warned us that the definition is just a starting point. And I think that's something very important for us to remember, that it's okay for us to throw around these definitions on the internet, but that's just the starting point of any discussion about veganism, because veganism is a big idea and you simply can't capture it in, you know, a couple of sentences in a definition. So if you go back then to the founders, then we're looking at a big idea. We're talking about a social movement which had values about peace, non-violence, justice, and it was founded while the Second World War, so-called, was still on. It was founded in 1944. Now, that's a radical thing to do. And because of the people we're dealing with, which, you know, you could call them gentle English folk, if you like, and the fact that they didn't write in a particularly polemic kind of way, as I mentioned, I think, in number one I did. You know, a lot of their radicalism is lost, but the idea of veganism is a radical one. And right from the start and throughout the history of writing about veganism, if you go to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s with Movement for Compassionate Living, then it always talked about human issues as well. So in David Nybert's terms, we're talking about, they recognize the entanglements of oppression and liberation, especially the liberation bit with Leslie Cross. He believed that veganism was part and parcel of the moral evolution of humanity. He basically thought that once we get a vegan mindset, then everything about the world would be changed. You know, we would actually have a chance of having a peaceful world. I mean, he even talked about you know, milk persons. I think he probably used the phrase milkmen in those days, but he talked about deliveries of milk being plant-based milk in those days. Of course, didn't realize that deliveries of milk would be stopping, but he had this kind of like utopian vision of a vegan future which was good for humans and other animals. So for the early vegans, the liberation of other animals was wrapped up in the consequent liberation of humans as well. So if you're one of these people who want to keep veganism down and limited and reduced, all that means to me is that you're out of step with the founders of the movement. And so that's fair enough. You can claim what you like about veganism, but because you want it to be something doesn't make it something. And so as I said, I'm going to keep this short, so I'm probably going to finish there. I'm going to just refer to the blog entry that I'll put below where I kind of put this case obviously in more detail, and let's try to have an adult conversation about what veganism is, remembering that veganism is a very radical idea. Now, if you're not radical enough for veganism, that's fine, but don't try and pretend it's something else. Veganism is a radical justice for all philosophy, and any attempt to reduce it, I think, is wrong. At the very least, if you're going to try and reduce it to something else, then at least acknowledge that that's what you're doing. I think that's the only fair thing to do, and therefore then people can learn the full meaning, if you like, of what veganism means, and then they can decide whether they want to support a reduced, impoverished version or not, or whether they can stick to and adhere to a more radical, expansive version of veganism, which obviously I would hope that they do. Okay, Roger and Neville signing off. I shall see you again. Bye for now.